Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you might be, and welcome to a post about books. My present obsession, it's called Selling a Thread Pulled from Someone Else's Tapestry. Professional writers know that a new type of book or plot is constructed by weaving stories from the public domain and from real life into a tapestry composed of threads that are either foundational, made up of lived experience, or made up of old stories. For some amateur authors, it might be tempting to pull one of those threads loose from a book they like and weave it into their own tapestry in a similar fashion. Perhaps they spotted a golden thread and thought they could use it to profit. One might wonder who owns the copyright for that golden thread, and if removing it from another author's work impacted that author's ability to profit. Removing a golden thread might take some of the sparkle away from the original author's work and give it to the work of a person who stole it, as when a modern author extracts the central plot line from a classic, multi-dimensional, well-researched, well-plotted novel like Shogun by James Clavell, shearing away side plots and adding a bit more blood, gore, and single-dimensional political messaging. If the stolen thread is a universal story that describes, for example, every person's life at a given moment in time, that surely can't be copyrighted. But when it describes details of a specific person's vision of life at a given moment, and he or she had taken the time to write it down, can another author just come along and take that worldview, selling that story to the highest bidder? If it is the life of a celebrity, and another author takes that story as viewed through the eyes of the media and her acquaintances, she probably has no ownership of that story, since she gave it to the public when she walked outside of her home. If it is the life of a fictional character, and another author writes it up in a new style, but with the same basic organization and details, I think there are clear legal precedents. You can't copyright an idea, but you can copyright the sequence of ideas that expresses that idea. One can diagnose when a legal red line has been crossed based on the length and uniqueness of a sequence. And people get so confused when they hear there are no new stories, because so many stories are familiar to us, and we can often express a story just by listing off, say, 4 plot points or 8 plot points even. But when the number of plot points exceeds the capacity of human memory, for example, if it's 55 sequential plot points, I think that a legal red line has been crossed. And in the case of Harry Potter versus Tanya Grotter and the magical double bass, the legal precedent was 14 plot points, 14 sequential unique plot points can be copyrighted. A wonderfully kind book reviewer read my story and my first novel and focused on how I used the story of Alice in Wonderland to structure my novel. And since Alice in Wonderland is in the public domain, what I did was okay. I can use public domain stories to structure my work. But meanwhile, I've been obsessing over how a plagiarist used a central thread of my story to structure a novel he sold to the public and heavily promoted and made a lot of money off of, more than $1 million probably. Since my story wasn't in the public domain, I think that what he did was not okay. If you count up all of the elements, you get, 55 or 35, or there are actually, by now I've found 5 different people who have taken between 35 and 55 sequential plot elements from my book, suggesting that they were using it as a template. And I think that's not okay. If you click on the blog post, you can see some of my technical analysis, how I chart these things out. Now, did this plagiarist use Alice in Science Wonderland as a backdrop for his story? No. From the tapestry of my book, he pulled out the central thread of my story and wove it into a rather mundane present-day backdrop. It describes my vision of life as a postmodern woman, and he sold it, passing it off as his own invention, taking my song and singing it in a different voice, essentially pulling what I see as the heart and soul out of my book and trading it for cash. Then again, maybe I am misreading the situation, and when I'm trying to figure out how things work in the world, I use fiction as a tool to help myself stretch and think outside of the box, out past the things I can see. And when I do this, I know that this is not reality. This is pure speculation. It is just a tool to try to see an array of possibilities that are uncertain. And when you try to interact with the publishing industry, there are so many things that you do not know as an author about how the systems work, how they make their decisions. And so I wrote a story to try to guess how I think things might be working. It's probably wrong, but maybe parts of it are right. And if you also use stories to help yourself think outside of the box, maybe you will enjoy it. So here goes. Consider William, a fictional character who might be the same person as Bill Randall in the novel I've been writing. This is a character development exercise. So, William has so many clothes. He has so many it is absurd. But clothes are what he likes. Often when he sees you, he doesn't see you. He only sees your clothes. And if he likes them enough, he will find a way to get you out of them and take them home with him. He will distract you so that you won't even miss them. Then he'll wear the clothes for a little while just to see if they impress any of his friends in the entertainment industry. But when none of them show any interest, he'll give them a good wash and sell them on eBay. There are high-end and low-end markets, and if he sells them to a high-end market, you might see a famous person wearing your clothes someday. What an honor! Famous people don't ask how their clothes were made or how the words that they're given to speak were made. Meanwhile, William sits and stares at his wardrobe, full of stolen clothes. He so often wore the clothes of other people that he sometimes lost track of who he really was. For him, everything was a form of clothing: a voice, an internet footprint, the type of blender in the kitchen, the type of woman on his arm. Would you want him to wear you? Perhaps this was all just a defensive measure. He'd once been worn and discarded by someone, so he preemptively treated everyone he met in that way, only feeling secure in a relationship if he was sure he had you locked up, naked in a cage in his basement. Consider Joe, a person who investigates people like William. Joe remembered a story about how in a time before germ theory, people figured out that 2 maternity hospitals had different mortality rates because doctors would always pass through the morgue on their way to the second hospital, bringing their books to carrying deadly bacteria with them. Joe saw this as an allegory about authors bringing their books to literary agents. If they brought it to Agent A, their book would be dead on arrival, but if they brought it to Agent B, it would result in a live birth. Joe figured out that Agent A became deadly to new authors after his exposure to the place where all of the dead books are stored. After eating the rotting fruit from that tree of knowledge, an agent couldn't wash away the temptation to mix together dead stories with living stories and sell the zombie product as his own creation. Joe figured out that the way to reduce the corruption of literary agencies is to remove their access to the trove of dead books. Joe understands that people like William damage the social fabric when they can't resist pulling out the living threads of freshly born books, or condemning viable books to the pile of dead stories. Broken-hearted mothers are often the ones who tip a precarious political balance into chaos, and stealing their books is not okay. After all, the fates are angered when someone steals a golden thread that doesn't belong to them. William isn't all bad, of course. He's just a person. He's ashamed of his weaknesses and seeks to atone. Richard, his partner, friend, and minder, knows that William developed this weakness when he got married to a woman of whom his father did not approve. She was a writer, and she encouraged her husband to be a writer, frittering away his energy on what his father viewed as frivolous pursuits. William and his wife viewed the work as necessary to heal their damaged, debauched souls. Since their debauchery continued regardless, one might contend that William's father was partially correct, that their behavior was merely self-indulgent and childish. One day, William's father came to his son's home and rifled around in his studio, looking through all of his papers, convinced that his son was mad. All he saw was words, frivolous words. Enraged, he barged into William's wife's room and went through all of her papers, convinced that she was the source of his son's madness. She shrieked at him to get out, and he shoved her aside, provoking a conflict between William and his father that didn't ever heal. William spent the rest of his marriage desperately justifying the time he had spent accumulating piles upon piles of stories that, with every passing year, showed their age in both style and content. When he couldn't find anyone to buy his stories and prove his father wrong, he began to freshen them up with the best bits of work submitted to him by people who hoped he might help them be published and recognized by their own parents. He even went as low as stealing stories from people no one would ever notice, stealing their entire work and publishing it under the name of a brand he controlled. As a literary vampire, William was able to construct so many stories in this fashion that he began to sell them on the open market to rich people who were too lazy to write their own books. Even though his bosses knew about this scheme, they let it continue because they liked having leverage over influential people. In fact, anyone with any fame or influence has a skeleton in the closet. That is part of the reason that they were allowed to become famous. William was getting tired of these schemes, tired of feeding his wife's vanity and feeding off of her praise, tired of feeding the vanity of celebrities as they rose and fell, and tired of feeding the fakeness of the knowledge economy. Life can be so gray when all of your illusions have been removed. Then one day, William stumbled across a manuscript that was so different from anything he'd seen before that he began to feel like Salieri, marveling at the naive genius of a young Mozart. It was as though the essence of the zeitgeist had been plucked out of thin air, as though picked up by a radio receiver. He'd never seen anything like it in style or content. It was an odd mixture of new motifs woven together with a golden thread, representing the real-life story of the woman who wrote it. Despite his growing tone deafness and the professional efficiency with which he could either polish other people's mashups or combine other people's songs into a medley of barely marketable noise, he knew that the only way to ensure that this Mozart song would rise above the cacophony would be to commit a crime so brazen that no one would fault him for committing it. He would insert one of Mozart's melodies into a work he would sell to a famous author. Everyone would hear that melody, and when they heard it again, in its original symphonic form, they would love it. William's boss was pleased with his work and invited him into a palatial complex to reward him. William was nearing retirement age, and there were ways of dealing with people like him. A 20-something honeypot in training swam up to him in the nude and asked him for a towel. She was high in ambition but low in talent, and they decided that she would do a better job as a mother than as a spy or an actress. During the party, she took good care of old William, and later called him up to let him know that she was pregnant with his child. He was her sperm donor, and this was just how things were done. William's wife already wanted a divorce, and wouldn't like the fact that she now had an adopted 20-something pregnant granddaughter to contend with. So William did the customary thing and paid to have the young woman attend a writing course in Budapest, where she would have the baby without anyone noticing. He could get to know her through her writing, and on this basis he could decide to either move to Budapest for his retirement, where she would keep an eye on him for the sake of his employer, or he would put her up in a cheap house on the outskirts of London, and he would live his life as usual. This sort of organized entrapment was just how things were done with men of his profession. His father had probably dealt with similar issues. William felt stupid for falling for yet another trap, placing yet another heavy golden chain around his neck. His friend Ricky was happily married, and William was jealous. He wanted to be in love too, and there was nothing to love about this young honeypot's writing. She could barely see past the tip of her little freckled makeup-coated nose. He wanted more, to feel safe and secure in a relationship that was not just orchestrated by his boss's dog trainers. Despite all of the cynicism to which he'd been exposed, he was still tormented by his inner romantic hero. He didn't like seeing Mozart's symphony disappear into the morass of dead novels that had been rejected by censors for being too inflammatory or transformative, only to be picked over by talentless money-laundering hacks who feel free to steal whatever shiny threads fit into their insipid mashups. The world was in flames already, and he could see that the fault lay squarely on the shoulders of censors who stupidly tried to play God and shape the zeitgeist, but who really had no idea what they were doing. They'd caused things to be quiet in the short term, but at the expense of explosive reactions in the long term. It was like modern monetary policy applied to human emotion. Now, I'm just making all of this up. This is just an exploration of what if it was like that? And I really don't know what is going on in the real world. In the fictional realm, I am torn between cynicism and romance, and stories like these are so difficult to interpret because you can only speculate about the gambler's original intent after all of the cards have been played. Did he want to kill you, steal from you, marry you? Is success a fate worse than death? Did he help you to save you from having your mind erased by crazy people living at the base of a volcano in Hawaii? Should I write a scene in which commandos storm and destroy a mind erasure center, freeing the patients within? These are questions I would rather answer within the context of my fictional work, like my novel about Mr. and Mrs. Randall, which I've kind of daisy-chained throughout my blog. But I'd like my real life to be far less uncertain and dangerous. With that, I would like to thank you for watching and encourage you to tune in for my next videos. The next ones are going to be very focused on trying to understand why my book got stolen so many times. 5 times is just, it's weird. It's almost like it's a systematic, or it's like an automated process almost. And in the following posts, there will be more investigations along those lines. And I am aware that when trying to figure out what's going on, you do venture into crazy, wrong territory. But, you know, you're walking around blind. You have to kind of try and you have to make guesses and just improvise, I guess. But thank you.